Good afternoon, colleagues. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to be with you this afternoon, and my sincere thanks to all of you who have given up your lunch hour to be here. Since the topic is forgiveness, I hope that you will forgive me for that. And in particular, my thanks to the Division for Research Development, and particularly to the members of the Forum Lecture Committee for inviting me to speak to you today. So Dr. Taron and colleague Felicia McDonald, you've been wonderful in helping me to be prepared, and I appreciate that a great deal. So as the topic suggests, what we're going to do today is we're going to focus on the impossibility of forgiveness, and the choice of that word impossibility will become clearer as we go through. And in particular, what complexifies this notion of forgiveness in South Africa are these intersections of religion, race, and politics, and a number of associated areas, and we'll delve into them. So, just to say that the topic of today's presentation comes out of a body of research that I've been engaged in for the last 4 years, which has just been concluded, and a little plug, the book will be coming out with Sun Media in the Bayes Nadir series within the next couple of weeks. So I know you all can't wait to get out there and buy it, so please do that. It helps the Bayes Nadir Centre. But we're going to focus a little bit today on South African Methodist political theologies. How's that for a mouthful? And that'll become clearer in a moment. And the complicated relationship between members of black and white religious communities in South Africa. In particular, we're going to try and answer the question, is forgiveness in South Africa a possibility or an impossibility, since it's such a contested notion? So that's a little bit of an outline of what we'll cover, and if you need to leave before the end for whatever reason, comfort, or needing to get to another session, you have it there. So I want to begin by telling you a little story of what happened in these interactions. The project that I was involved in worked with a group of white South African Methodist Christians and black South African Methodist Christians, and in particular we were interested to see these two communities had been separated racially, and we were interested to see what might each of these communities regard as the concept of forgiveness, what does forgiveness mean, and what might be some of the preconditions or expectations for them to begin to talk about the possibility of forgiveness. So not forgiveness per se, but what might possibilize that. And I want to share with you one little instance that took place. So we worked with intercultural Bible reading sessions where we brought these groups together and they read a specific biblical text. The Bible became a sort of reflective surface, a centering power in the conversation that allowed them to engage in a common task, to try and figure out what might this text have to say about forgiveness, and that allowed for some interaction that wasn't direct interaction. It allowed for some interaction through interpretations of the text, so it was mediated in that sense. It was a hermeneutic engagement. Some way into the intercultural Bible reading process, an event took place where two of the male members got into an argument in one of the sessions, and they were basically arguing about reparations, restorative justice, the issue of white privilege, and South Africa's apartheid history. And the white participant was saying, you know, can't we just stop talking about apartheid? I know it was wrong, it was sinful, I've confessed it to God, I believe God has forgiven me and us, and we just need to move on. And all this talk about white privilege, reparation, it's just nonsense. I've worked for everything that I have, and there's no way that I can repay anything. And they were engaged in quite a robust discussion around that, as you can imagine. Until the black participant stopped the white participant and asked him a question. And he said to him, tell me, are you a parent? To which the white participant said, yes, I am. And he said, when you think about your children's future, when you dream about their lives, what do you dream about? to which the white participant replied something to the extent, I dream that they'll be happy and healthy and safe and secure. And the black participant said, well, guess what? I have the same dream. And I think that that captures something of what we were trying to understand in this particular study. How we can move beyond very entrenched positions, often where there is no willingness even to understand the other, to begin to find spaces of connection around which people can talk. So, why impossible forgiveness? Now, forgiveness as a theological and social discourse in South Africa is deeply contested. Numerous South African scholars and activists, some of them in this room, have raised concerns about the transactional nature of the concept of forgiveness. In particular, there are concerns about the expectation that the concept places on persons who have been wronged. Is it morally acceptable to expect a person or community who has been harmed to forgive the other? And if there are certain instances in which this may be acceptable or desirable, what are the expectations of the perpetrators of harm? Now, what is clear is that forgiving another for wrongdoing is a complex and difficult process. And theological understandings of forgiveness vary a great deal amongst persons who hold religious beliefs, and the same can be said for Christians. And this is particularly so when persons hold different understandings of the concept based on their social identity and their current contextual reality. It will be shown as we go through today's lecture that social identity shaped by notions such as race, culture, economic reality, of course theological beliefs, and current experience play a significant role in the hermeneutics of forgiveness. So hermeneutics is the science of interpretation, how people give meaning to their beliefs. Moreover, interpersonal socio-political factors such as the nature of the historical offence, whether reparation has been made or attempted, the political identities of the parties involved, expectations and conditions for the self and for the other also play a role in understandings of forgiveness. And naturally, you can imagine that this is particularly contested in present-day South Africa. Now, at this point, I want to make a brief discursus on an aspect of terminology. In my writing, and whenever I have the chance to speak, I encourage colleagues not to use the phrase post-apartheid South Africa. And my colleague Jacob Buerta and I have written a little bit about this. Although political apartheid ended in South Africa when the first democratic elections took place in April 1994, the reality is that the daily experience of most South Africans, apartheid remains very present. And as we shall see, economic segregation, racial and spatial and geographic segregation, ongoing racism, and the politics of identity seem to be worse today than they were in 1994, certainly in some qualitative senses. And so my work, particularly with young black South African activists, many who were born into freedom after 1994, has led me to the conviction that the use of the term post-apartheid South Africa is disingenuous. It compounds the suffering of those who experience the slow violence of poverty, those who are disenfranchised and cut off from political and social agency. By using that language, it suggests that their daily experience is not valid or real. So within the South African social, political, and economic and religious context, forgiveness of the self and the other needs to be considered. And some have suggested that forgiveness is a necessary condition for moving forward for a better future for all South Africans. And indeed, that nothing will be able to change until we are able to get to a reconciled or forgiven state. However, as recent research shows, we are facing some challenges in this regard. The Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, in their Reconciliation Barometer, indicated that economic inequality is probably the largest issue that stands in the way of any form of constructive engagement between the races in South Africa. The last line of that quotation, most believe that it's impossible to achieve a reconciled society for as long as those who were disadvantaged under apartheid remain poor within the new South Africa. Now, recent events in South Africa, such as the Fees Must Fall protests against economic inequalities and economic injustice in higher education, and the spate of racial slurs and denials of black pain on social media, Penny Sparrow and Mrs. Ziller being two examples of that, and the re-racialization of society through identity politics seem to support the IJR's findings. South Africa faces significant challenges when it comes to dealing with the sins of our past and the complexity of our current life. So the question is, in this reality, how do people understand forgiveness? What does it mean if you are black and South African, or if you are white and South African, to begin to engage this terminology? Is forgiveness possible or impossible? Now, the use of the phrase impossible in brackets is deliberate. The notion is predicated on Derrida's use of impossible in his lecture, A Certain Impossible Possibility of Saying the Event. Just the title is philosophically dense. And also on Richard Carney's discussion of this concept in relation to forgiveness, that my colleague Helhart introduced me to, forgiveness as the limit, impossible or possible. And the concept is discussed in greater detail in some of my other work, but what I want to point out today is the importance in my usage of the term is the tension that the phrase creates between what is impossible and so becomes, by its very nature, possible. The bracketing of what makes the impossible possible. As will be shown, the impossibility of forgiveness, the fact that true forgiveness is not possible in an economic or in a practical sense, is what makes true forgiveness, certainly in a theological sense, both possible and necessary. The question is, how could one ever attach a price to compensate for the violence of apartheid? What possible act or gesture could truly account for the dehumanizing consequences of this social and political system? Now, by asking these questions, I'm not meaning to imply that they are unimportant. In fact, they are crucial and they are necessary. However, what the question does raise is the contingent relationship that some political actors place between mere political, economic, and social recompense and the true nature of humanization and rehumanization in South Africa. So in this sense, we can claim that forgiveness is both a theological and a political construct. So let's move on to consider how the participants in the study conceptualized forgiveness. And we're going to discuss that under the heading of a politics of forgiveness. Now, before we discuss the findings of the project, it's worth just clarifying why the term or concept or process of forgiveness was chosen when it is so contested, and why didn't my research rather focus on mercy, or retribution, or compensation, or reconciliation? These seem to be fairly popular terms in public discourse. Why such a deeply religious and theologically textured concept as forgiveness? Now, South Africa remains a deeply religious nation. As we shall see from the most recent General Household Survey, it's not too bad, you should be able to see that. The survey shows that 84.2% of South Africans self-identify as Christians. Now, the interesting thing is that this is an increase of 4.4% from the 2001 General Household Survey. So the largest percentage of South Africa's citizens indicate that they have some, even though nominal, relationship to the Christian faith. The question is, however, not whether they have this identity, but what role does religion play in their public and political lives. In 2010, a Pew report found that 74% of South Africans indicated that religion plays, and I quote, an important role in their lives. So I naturally had to go and work out what is the quality of that importance. And interestingly enough, Professor Henny de Tooy, I think it is, who works on the Global Values Survey here at Stellenbosch, actually wrote about this. He explains the importance of the role of religion in this way. The report notes that while trust in political institutions and public institutions recedes, In contrast, civil society organizations, including religious organizations, enjoy the greatest level of trust amongst South Africans. So religion in general, he goes on to say, and churches in particular, play an important role in the political socialization of South Africans. So in this sense, from the overview of the statistics and what was presented in that research, we can say at least two things. First, South Africa remains a nation in which religious language and religious imagery plays an important role. Secondly, that South Africans place a great deal of trust and confidence in their religious convictions, their religious leaders, and in faith communities, since these are amongst the most trusted institutions in society. And the church clearly has a significant role as a social institution that bears a great deal of respect among South Africans. So, for this particular reason, the concept of forgiveness was chosen. I go into that in some detail in my research, discussing some of the current social imaginary around the language, particularly after the TRC. The notion of forgiveness was mainstreamed in public political discourse. Whether you agree with it or not, it became a very important term. So let's move on to the next section, the politics of forgiveness and social identity, complexity, they should say, in South Africa. Now, what the research found was that South Africans hold very different views on the concepts and processes of forgiveness from this particular study. My colleague Robert Vosloo, writing about forgiveness, said the following about the unfinished business of forgiveness in South Africa. He says, forgiveness and related concepts regarding engagement with the past continue to be influential but highly contested in public discourse. And I think this is true for Christian communities as well. Together with my colleague Melika Fourie and Dr. Wilhelm Verwoerd, for the past 3 days we've been doing a series of talks at one of the largest churches in our area, a church I think that has about 6,000 members, but I think it's almost entirely white. And we often find that in faith communities there's a very, very strong homogenous racial, cultural, and even class identity that gets entrenched. So it's a significant problem, not only in society, but also in churches. And so this was the problem that I was given by the two ministers of the two Methodist churches in Somerset West, the Reverend Jean Murcott and the Reverend Yvette Moses, who said, how can we help our two communities to find one another? So the first thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to be able to give some logic, some structure, some content to the manner in which their theological convictions might be related to the other aspects of their primary identity. So I used this particular model, which was the model that I developed in my first doctoral research, which was done just before the New Testament was written. That's how long ago it was. It's wonderful when you do something very long ago and you find it still has a little bit of use. But this particular model of identity is a sort of complexity model of identity, an integral model, which relies on the fact that any person who makes meaning, constructs meaning of any concept, will always rely on 4 aspects of their experience and their reality. And often what we find, particularly in academic studies, is that we tend to collapse our studies into one of the 4 quadrants. So let me just quickly talk you through them. If we look on the left-hand side, we have the 2 interior quadrants, and on the right-hand side, we have the exterior aspects of life. And then if we look at the top and the bottom, the top deals with the individual and the bottom with the collective. So the top left corner, the upper left, deals with issues of faith, belief, spirituality. This is often where Christianity, theology, psychology tends to operate. The bottom one is sociology, aspects of theology. So this has to do with our collective identity, things like culture, even maleness, femaleness, whiteness, these aspects come in here. What is there about our identity that we receive in an intersubjective manner from one another. The top right are those aspects of our identity which others can see objectively, aspects of our individual identity. Whether you are tall or short is an adiaphora. It's not a moral problem, but people can turn it into a problem. And the same comes with issues like whiteness or blackness. People can turn it into a problem. The bottom right-hand one tends to do with collective exterior things, such as where you are born. The fact that you are born in South Africa in 1963 and not in Chicago has a massive impact on your social identity. So what we did was we worked with these groups and we asked them, after reading this particular text, Matthew chapter 18 verses 15 to 35, you can go and read it if you'd like to. We asked them to describe for us what does forgiveness mean and what might it mean to forgive the members of the other community. And the research found this. So we did this for a number of weeks, but this is what the research found. The black Christian community tended to articulate notions of forgiveness in a social and a political manner. So the content of what they shared in their groups was that forgiveness would only be a reality if the conditions for forgiveness were experienced. So basically they were saying, we're not willing to go for cheap forgiveness. We're not willing to go for forgiveness as a spiritual concept. We want to see the fruits of forgiveness in our society. We want to live, first of all, in reconciled communities, the bottom left. We want to see that we are truly able to reconcile with white sisters and brothers and have nothing to hold against them. But we also want to see that that is attached to the material reality in which we live. And so they called for economic, social, and political transformation. And these are some of the things which I think we need to highlight in our churches and religious communities as well. Interestingly enough, in terms of predominantly westernized, white social identity in South Africa, we found a very similar thing, that social identity constructs tended to shape hermeneutic principles. The predominantly white middle-class community tended to individualize and spiritualize forgiveness. So just to explain that to you, one of the members said, and I quote, "Apartheid was wrong, but it's over. I confessed my part in it and I believe God has forgiven me." So you can see there's an individual understanding of forgiveness. The sin of apartheid that is committed is primarily a sin that has spiritual consequences. And so the offended party is not the neighbor. It's not the person with whom we live. The offended party, the one who holds the sin against me, is God. And so all that is required to restore harmony is to receive God's forgiveness. Now, it's not difficult to see how persons who hold these very different views of the politics of forgiveness, because both of these are political positions, they situate the person in relation to the rest of society. It's not difficult to see how these may come into conflict with one another. Okay, the good news is we are moving towards the end. Okay, when I preach in my church, this is normally when people start saying, "Thank you, Lord." Okay, so we're almost at the end. So part of goodness, now I can't even think of the word in English or Afrikaans. Part of the task that I was given, the project that was given to me by these two ministers, was to figure out what might be possible so that these two communities could find one another. That was an intended part of the study. And what the research showed was that what we needed to do, because people's hermeneutic views, because their construction of their beliefs was so culturally informed, that we needed to try and facilitate instances in which positive intercultural engagement could take place. And so the theory that was used in the constructing of these intercultural biblical groups is Intergroup Contact theory. So many of you, I'm sure, know about this theory. Alport and Hugh Stone, we have here at Stellenbosch, Herman Swart, who's done a lot of really great work. I know Professor Gobodo Madikizela and her team do a lot of work on this. But basically what intergroup contact theory suggests is that very often we hold on to our views, our in-group views, and we do so in relation to out-group views. And if if our view of the out-group is one that is relatively positive, or we are not threatened by them, we are willing to engage their views, or at least how we perceive their views. But if there is a measure of intergroup contact anxiety, and this is something which is very, very prevalent in South Africa, a lack of understanding of the other, we tend not even to encounter the other, but only our prejudice of the other. And what often happens in those situations is that people become entrenched in their theological views. They begin to say that the views of the other are wrong and my views are correct. So what we did in our groups, I'm just giving you the 2-minute version of this, was we facilitated these group meetings in such a way that a number of conditions were present. And these were things like equal status, working together towards a common task, the need for cooperation with the other to complete the task, and permission from authorities. So the church saying, we are literally asking you to engage in this task of working with our sisters and brothers to find forgiveness. And we found that under the carefully facilitated conditions of positive intergroup contact, because mere contact is not enough, it has to be positively facilitated. Under the conditions of positive intergroup contact, we were able to lessen intergroup contact anxiety, as the story at the beginning shows. Where there is space to differ and the opportunity to encounter the other in safety, intergroup contact anxiety was lessened. And what happened as a result of that, and this is the area in which Melika has worked particularly, is that empathy became possible. So, as we heard in the story right at the beginning, the first kind of empathy that seems to operate in those situations is what's known as affective empathy. The moment the one person could begin to see you're a parent and you have children and feel about them in the same way that I as a parent feel about them, they were humanized. And that affective empathy, the emotional connection, allows for cognitive empathy. If I can understand how you feel, I might be willing to consider that I understand how you think. So I'm going to end just in a moment. The one thing that I do want to say about the research is that the findings of this particular research project are not normative. We worked with a very, very contained, it was a case study. We worked only with 2 communities, and further research will come out of this, we hope, in which we can expand the population group. We also recognize that the study itself had some very clear objectives. But for the problem owner, the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, Helderberg Circuit, the question was, does this mean that forgiveness is impossible? And I think from this we can say that even though the discourse of forgiveness in South Africa is highly contested and often used in very, very problematic ways, it's not impossible. Certainly from a theological perspective, my commitment to the continued engagement with this term is very strong. I often say in my classes that, and this is now where we're getting seriously theological, but if we believe in eschatology, if we believe that there will come a day when injustice ends, I always say to my students, think of that day. You know the day I'm talking about. The day we read about in Revelation 21, where there will be no more hatred, no more death, no more crime. If you think about that day, and you think about South Africa in that day, our only choice at the moment, our ethical choice, is to ask ourselves where we will position ourselves in relation to that reality. And in my conception of the eschaton, forgiveness is important. So I end with this quote from Martha Nussbaum, who says, "The ability to imagine the experience of another, a capacity almost all human beings possess in some form, needs to be greatly enhanced and refined if we are to have any hope of sustaining decent institutions across the many divisions that any modern society contains." And in my estimation, that also includes the church. Thank you.